Hello friends, this is Grief speaking, and today I'm going to be digging into the Disturbing Comic Book Iceberg. I've spent much of the last year focusing on Japanese media, mostly manga, so now I'd like to dig into the disturbing world of Western comics, and this feels like a good way to get a general overview. I'll give a brief summary and explanation of each entry, but if you guys find any particular comic interesting, let me know and I'll do a standalone, long-form explanation video on it like I did for Beneath the Trees Where Nobody Sees. Shout out to Bloody Locks Bathory for creating this iceberg. I think it's very well crafted, and honestly, creating an iceberg like this is just as hard as explaining one, so big thank you to them. In this video, we'll be tackling tiers 1 and 2, and I have to say, I've been out of the horror comic scene too long because I didn't know a lot of these, which makes for a great iceberg. So let's get into the iceberg and this video's sponsor, Filmora. So let's begin with Tier 1, Beginners. Starting with Arkham Asylum, a serious house on serious Earth. Easily one of the most disturbing Batman stories, Arkham Asylum released in 1989 and has continued to stand out as a disturbing piece of fiction to this day, as well as defining Batman as a more psychologically complex character. Arkham is taken over by the inmates, led by the Joker. They demand that Batman enter the asylum to experience it himself, and from there it's a deep dive into psychological horror. As Batman lingers in the asylum, he begins to question whether he himself belongs inside. One of the major elements of this comic, and a large part of why it's so disturbing, is the art by Dan McKean. The characters all look absolutely psychotic, especially the villains, and you actually feel like you're going crazy just looking at these grotesque images. Batman, the Killing Joke. The Killing Joke is another disturbing Batman comic. In most Batman media, Joker threatens to kill people, but usually Batman saves the day before anyone gets hurt. In The Killing Joke, Joker is ruthless, shooting Commissioner Gordon's daughter in the spine and paralyzing her. He kidnaps Gordon after this and subjects him to physical and psychological torture at an abandoned carnival. He strips him naked for all the carnival freaks to ridicule, and one of the most disturbing parts is when Joker forces Commissioner Gordon to look at naked photos of his own wounded daughter. In flashback scenes, we get a possible origin story for Joker as a failed stand-up comedian that gets mixed up with criminals and falls into a vat of chemicals, leaving him permanently disfigured. Beasts of Burden. Beasts of Burden follows a group of dogs who are appointed defenders of Burden Hill, a small town with dark secrets. It's an interesting premise as the humans are unaware of the dark forces that haunt the town, and the dogs are fighting this supernatural war against all manner of creatures, including zombie dogs, Lovecraftian-style grave-robbing creatures, giant frogs, and swarms of evil rats. The art style is super cute, which is why it's so off-putting when you see the blood and gore throughout. The Butcher of Paris. Set in 1944 Paris, this is a historical crime comic miniseries based on the true story of serial killer Marcel Petiot. The comic follows a French detective investigating a disturbing case involving numerous missing persons. As Germans have invaded and occupy the city, there's rumors floating around about a man who promises desperate people, especially Jews fleeing the Nazis, a safe passage out of France. Instead, these people have begun to vanish without a trace. The detective soon discovers that the disappearances are linked to Dr. Marcel Petiot, a seemingly respectable physician. Under the guise of helping refugees escape to South America, Petiot lured his victims to his home, where he murdered them, dismembered their bodies, and disposed of them in horrific ways. His crimes were only discovered when his townhouse was found filled with corpses. This earned him the nickname the Butcher of Paris. Creepy. Creepy was a classic horror anthology series that ran from 1964 to 1983 and has also been revived a number of times since. Each issue contains several self-contained horror stories that were tied together by the narrator Uncle Creepy, a ghoulish, crypt keeper inspired character. A lot of the stories featured in Creepy had fairly disturbing concepts, especially for the time period. Heavy gore, grotesque body horror, and disturbing sexual content like necrophilia were littered throughout. An interesting note on Creepy is how it found a way to bypass restrictions on content. In the 50s, horror comics were very popular, but garnered backlash from parents, politicians, and other assholes because of their violent content. This led to an infamous US Senate hearing in 1954 on juvenile delinquency, where horror comics were blamed for encouraging immoral acts in children. After this, the comic book industry created the Comics Code Authority, which banned graphic violence, gore, sexual content, and anti-authority themes. Bullshit, right? Well, Warren Publishing, which launched Creepy, found a loophole by printing the comic in black and white and on oversized pages, which technically moved it to the magazine category. Since it technically wasn't a comic book, the CCA didn't apply. Pretty punk rock. The Crow. You're probably familiar with the Crow movie starring Brandon Lee. The film itself stands out for its dark atmosphere and disturbing story, but it's also become notorious because Brandon Lee died on set when he accidentally shot himself with a real gun after a series of dumb mistakes by the safety and props departments. Well, this movie is based on a comic which is actually much darker than the film. Eric Draven and his girlfriend's car break down and they're attacked by a vicious gang who force themselves on Eric's girl in front of him before killing her and then him. Eric is resurrected by a crow as an immortal revenge machine who tracks down the gang members to torture and kill them. In the comics, Eric Draven is much more psychotic, losing his grip on reality and randomly cutting himself. The really sad part about this comic is that the author, J.O. Barr, wrote the story after he actually lost his girlfriend in a fatal car accident. It's tragic, but he turned his pain into a very cool work of art. EC Comics. Entertaining Comics was one of the most influential comic book publishers of the 1940s and 50s, well known for their horror anthology comics such as The Haunt of Fear, The Vault of Horror, and most notably Tales from the Crypt, hosted by The Crypt Keeper. As I mentioned before, EC's horror comics directly led to the widespread moral panic surrounding comic books in the 50s. They eventually shifted from horror and sci-fi to publish a variety of genres, including Mad Magazine, which became one of the most successful satire magazines ever made. Eerie. Eerie was a kind of sister magazine to Creepy by the same publisher. It focused on slightly different themes, mostly leaning more into dark fantasy, gothic horror, and the supernatural, and instead of Uncle Creepy, Eerie was hosted by Cousin Eerie. It ran parallel to Creepy from 1966 to 1983 and bypassed the CCA using the same loophole. Emily Carroll's works. Emily Carrol is a horror comic artist who started out making webcomics. Her comics often have storybook qualities like a modernized Grimm's fairy tales. She gained widespread attention online for her comic His Face All Red, which was later published in her acclaimed collection Through the Woods. It follows a man who kills his brother in the woods after searching for a strange beast that had been coming into town to kill livestock. The man hides his brother's corpse in a mysterious hole they found in the deep woods, but a few days later, his brother shows back up perfectly fine. He tries to discern how this is possible and what exactly this entity posing as his brother is. If you like gothic horror and fairy tales, Through the Woods is a must-read. Carrol has since worked on a ton of projects, including Guillermo del Toro's Netflix show Cabinet of Curiosities and creating illustrations for the 2013 video game Gone Home. Fishtown. Fishtown is a dark, true crime-inspired comic based on the real-life murder of Jason Sweeney, who was killed in 2003 in Philadelphia. And Fishtown is the name of the Philly neighborhood where it all happened. It's got an interesting documentary style where the group of violent teens who murdered the kid tell the story from their perspective, along with all the drug-fueled violent behaviors that littered their chaotic lives. Last Look. The Last Look trilogy is comprised of 3 disturbing comics by Charles Burns: X'd Out, The Hive, and Sugar Skull. It follows a teenage boy, Doug, who has a head injury and memory loss as he navigates a surreal dream world that resembles a messed up version of Tintin. The story shifts between this dream world and his real life memories. It's interesting because the cartoonish style of the dream world is juxtaposed with this dystopian nightmare filled with body horror. As we follow his journey, we slowly piece together Doug's past, uncovering the truth surrounding his injury. The art is heavily inspired by Tintin comics and David Lynch's Dream Logic. Lenore, the cute little dead girl. This is a dark comedy horror series that originally ran in the 90s. It's heavily inspired by Tim Burton's early works, but much more disturbing. It follows Lenore, an undead mischief maker, in a bleak and unsettling world filled with strange people and gothic imagery. The art style is very cute and actually reminds me of early YouTube animations you might see from someone like David Firth. To give you an idea of the morbid humor in this comic, in the very first issue, Lenore is hired as a babysitter. She takes the baby to the park and decides to feed some birds, letting the baby hold the bird food. As she walks away to feed a bird, several more swoop down on the baby carriage and eat a lot more than just the food. In another issue, Lenore plays leapfrog and the girl jumping over her goes straight into a wood chipper. It's really just a ton of little stories like that. Reminds me of Happy Tree Friends with a gothic horror focus. Love and Rockets. Love and Rockets was one of the first comic books to push forward the alternative comics movement of the 1980s. It's mainly a slice of life drama following the lives of several people in the Central American village of Palomar, but it also showcases disturbing psychological horror, brutal violence, and deeply unsettling themes such as murder, sexual violence, and existential dread. Pride of Baghdad. This is a strange one. Taking place during the US invasion of Iraq in 2003, Pride of Baghdad is a fictionalized retelling of a true event where 4 lions escaped the Baghdad Zoo after a bombing destroyed their enclosure. The story is shown through the eyes of the lions, who are anthropomorphized and speak to each other. At first, they're excited about their newfound freedom until they venture into the now war-torn city and find that their enclosure wasn't so bad compared to to this hellscape. The comic doesn't shy away from the brutality of war, showing animal suffering, starvation, and sudden shocking deaths. Sheltered. Sheltered is a pre-apocalyptic tale. That's right, the end of the world hasn't happened yet, but that hasn't stopped a group of doomsday preppers from planning on it. This story follows a community of several families that are living at an off-the-grid compound called Safe Haven. Lucas, an unstable teenager, convinces the other children and teens that the adults are a liability, draining resources and keeping them weak. So him and some other teens kill all the adults in Safe Haven. Obviously, not everyone is on board with this plan, including Victoria, the protagonist, who fights back against Lucas. This one has some really brutal and disturbing moments, like when Lucas slaughters dozens of dogs and puppies, but it mostly focuses on psychological horror and the haunting reality of cult thinking. Spawn. I mean, what can you say about Spawn? It's one of the most influential comics of the 90s and has continued to be one of the most successful independent comics of all time. The story follows Al Simmons, a government assassin betrayed and murdered, who makes a deal with the demon to return to Earth, only to find himself resurrected as a disfigured hellspawn, stripped of his past life and manipulated by both heaven and hell. Spawn struggles to retain his humanity while battling supernatural creatures, corrupt humans, and his own decaying mind. He's just really badass and one of the most popular anti-heroes in comic history. This series is just full of disturbing stuff. It's violent, it's gory, and it features plenty of body horror as well. And of course, there's a host of demonic entities, most notably Spawn's consistent tormentor, Violator, who mostly takes the form of a disgusting clown with a sick sense of humor. Marvel's Ultimatum. This one's kind of wild. Ultimatum was a massive crossover event in the Ultimate Marvel Universe, Earth 1610, and was intended to be a major turning point in the Ultimate line of comics. But instead, it became one of the most controversial and widely criticized comics of the 2010s. The basic setup is that Quicksilver and the Scarlet Witch are killed, which enrages Magneto, sending him into a revenge-fueled fury. He steals Thor's hammer and uses it along with his magnetic powers to reverse Earth's polarity, causing natural disasters to kill millions of people around the globe. The comic then follows the surviving heroes as they deal with the aftermath. The reason this comic is so controversial is that a ton of major characters are killed off in gruesome ways, seemingly at random. The main criticism is that this is done just for shock value without any good story development underneath. Now, I haven't read the whole thing, so I'm not sure where I'll land on it, but it's pretty disturbing seeing so many big players getting wiped out, especially in particularly brutal ways. V for Vendetta. Another comic that got a fairly successful movie adaptation and also one of Alan Moore's most popular stories. V for Vendetta is set in a fascist totalitarian Britain and follows the actions of a masked anarchist and his attempt to overthrow the oppressive government, starting by bombing government buildings. The reason it's on the list is because of its disturbing elements, mostly regarding psychological torture. We learn that V was subject to horrific experiments in a secret facility. A girl named Evie becomes entangled with V, and in one of the most disturbing moments in the comic, V abducts and psychologically breaks Evie, making her believe she's imprisoned and being tortured by the government. He does this in order to supposedly free her mind, but it's pretty fucked up. Tom King's Vision. This series follows Marvel's Vision as he creates a family and tries to start a normal life in the suburbs. They're the picturesque, happy family in a perfect neighborhood until tragedy strikes one day. The Grim Reaper attacks the Visions. He calls them fakes and imposters in reference to his brother Wonder Man, whose brainwaves were used to create Vision. Vision's wife Virginia accidentally kills Grim Reaper and hides his body, but this begins a chain of violent events as Virginia will do anything to keep the truth hidden. At the same time, Vision's children, Viv and Vin, begin to question their existence and see humans as lesser. This all culminates in pure tragedy as the perfect life Vision set out to create all falls apart. And if you're wondering, this was in fact a huge inspiration for Marvel's show, WandaVision. The Walking Dead. The Walking Dead skyrocketed to fame mostly due to the hit TV show, but it started its success with the original comic book. Obviously, The Walking Dead has all manner of disturbing zombie violence and gore, but the real horror comes from how people break down when civilization collapses. This series is brutal, featuring gruesome deaths, cannibalism, psychological torment, and is well known for shocking character deaths. One of the most disturbing moments comes from the Governor, a manipulative, cruel, and deeply unstable man who thrives on power. Some spoilers here, but just a list of some of this guy's disturbing antics. He pulls out the teeth of his zombified niece, Penny, and makes out with her. He stages gladiator-style fights between prisoners and zombies and keeps severed heads in fish tanks for entertainment. But his most famous act of cruelty is when he captures, tortures, and sexually assaults Michonne, a fan-favorite character. But don't worry, she gets her revenge in full by torturing him and mutilating his body. Watchmen. Maybe Alan Moore's most famous comic, and also one of the most famous comic books on this list, Watchmen is set in an alternate history where superheroes change the course of politics and war. The story follows flawed, psychologically broken vigilantes grappling with power power and corruption, and the threat of nuclear annihilation. This comic does away with the conventions of seemingly perfect superhero good guys, instead showing that many heroes are dangerous, delusional, and outright monstrous. Rorschach is a brutal, uncompromising extremist, the comedian is a nihilistic murderer who assaults women, and the list goes on. One of the most disturbing elements is how Watchmen forces you to question morality, presenting a world where there's no clear heroes or villains, only people trying to justify their worst impulses. We Three is about a team of weaponized animals: Bandit the dog, Tinker the cat, and Pirate the bunny. After undergoing torturous experiments and procedures, the animals have been turned into killing machines, used by the US government to assassinate targets. The brutality of the kills is disturbing enough, but the torture these poor animals who are being tested on go through is horrific and sad, especially since their intelligence has been enhanced, giving them the limited ability to speak. These animals trying to understand what's happening to them with this level of intelligence is just really sad. When the Wind Blows. This is a dark and depressing satire. It follows a retired British couple, Jim and Helga Bloggs, as they unknowingly prepare for and endure a nuclear attack. Part of why this story is so tragic and disturbing is the cheerfully ignorant demeanor of the characters, who bicker like a typical old couple while preparing for nuclear war. Eventually, a bomb does drop and they somehow survive, only to deal with the effects of radiation poisoning, all while maintaining a naive and optimistic outlook even in the face of certain death. It's definitely one of the saddest on these two tiers. Tier 2. Advanced. 2000 AD / Judge Dredd. 2000 AD is a long-running sci-fi anthology comic starting in 1977, often featuring gritty, dark, and ultra-violent stories, most notably Judge Dredd. Judge Dredd is set in a dystopian future where the law is enforced by judges who serve as judge, jury, and executioner, brutally killing criminals with no trial. It's also worth noting that 2000 AD was the launching pad for many famous British authors such as Neil Gaiman and Alan Moore. Batman: The Black Mirror. This story follows Dick Grayson as he steps into the role of Batman while Bruce Wayne is away. The central villain isn't a costume criminal like usual, but James Gordon Jr., Commissioner Gordon's long-lost son, who returns to Gotham with a cold, serial killer-like demeanor and a hidden obsession with testing human morality. As the story unfolds, it becomes clear that James Jr. is a pure psychopath, devoid of empathy and driven by a quiet, remorseless cruelty. He calmly reveals to Barbara Gordon that he plans to kill her just to prove he can, and even experiments with removing morality from people entirely by secretly drugging Gotham's baby formula. Meanwhile, Batman investigates a black market auction of Gotham's darkest relics where crime lords bid on murder weapons, like the crowbar that killed Jason Todd, for instance. Dark stuff. Black Hole. From Charles Burns, the same author of the Look Back trilogy, Black Hole is a body horror comic about a strange STD that only teens can contract. Although this is far worse than a typical STD. It causes the teens to mutate in all manner of grotesque ways. Honestly, this one's pretty gnarly. It affects people in different ways. Some people just get deformed and grow boils like the Toxic Avenger. Some grow extra limbs. One girl even begins to shed her skin like a snake. And there's a guy whose penis turns into a corkscrew shape like a duck or something. I mean, what the hell? By Bizarre Hands. By Bizarre Hands is a graphic novel adaptation of Joe R. Lansdale's short stories, originally published in 1994. It features a series of twisted and grotesque stories, usually with a touch of dark humor. Some notable stories are the self-titled By Bizarre Hands, which follows a psychotic southern priest who believes God wants him to save people, which to him means kidnapping and murdering them. Another story, The Pit, is about a violent underground dogfighting ring, except instead of dogs, it's two humans forced to fight for the entertainment of their owners. Cradlegrave. Set in a poverty-stricken British housing estate, Cradlegrave follows Shane, a teenager recently released from a juvenile detention center and trying to stay on the up and up, which is hard in this neighborhood. Besides the typical depressing atmosphere of the crime-filled streets, there's something strange going on. People are acting erratic, a horrible rotting smell lingers in the air, and a mysterious elderly couple, Mary and Ted Bauer, seem to be acting completely unnatural. Shane soon discovers that Mary Bauer has transformed into an oozing, fleshy horror, sprouting strange growths all over her body. Soon, anyone who comes into contact with Mary begins to change in horrific ways, experiencing grotesque mutations, mindless euphoria, and a loss of free will. Meanwhile, Mary herself continues to transform into a giant Lovecraftian horror. Evil Ernie. Evil Ernie is a gory, over-the-top horror action series following the titular Evil Ernie, aka Ernest Fairchild, a psychotic undead killer who gains supernatural powers. Ernest was originally a troubled and abused child who was tormented by his sadistic parents and bullies. bullied. As a teenager, he began to hear voices in his head, particularly that of Lady Death, a seductive demonic entity who promised to give him love and power if he helped her wipe out humanity. And so Ernie snapped and went on a killing spree, only to be captured and eventually executed. Due to a scientific mishap and some supernatural tampering by Lady Death, Ernie is brought back to life and has gained the ability to resurrect and control the dead. Along with his sidekick, a talking smiley face button, evil Ernie is constantly causing chaos and killing everyone in sight in completely brutal ways. From Hell. Alan Moore's From Hell is an unsettling deep dive into the Jack the Ripper murders, blending real history with conspiracy and the occult. Instead of a whodunit, the comic clearly presents the killer as Sir William Gole, Queen Victoria's physician who commits the murders as part of a Masonic ritual meant to shape the future. The killings are slow, clinical, and ritualistic, portrayed in agonizing detail with Eddie Campbell's scratchy black and white art style, making everything feel grimy and bleak. But the horror goes beyond the murders. The brutality of Victorian society itself is pretty scary. Much of the concept is based on the real conspiracy theory that the Jack the Ripper murders were part of a plot to conceal the birth of an illegitimate royal baby fathered by Prince Albert Victor. It's also worth noting that this was made into a film in 2001 starring Johnny Depp. I never heard of that. A God Somewhere. This story follows Eric, a man who suddenly gains godlike abilities. At first he uses his powers for good, but over time his sanity begins to deteriorate. He believes that he was once a god in some other universe, and he becomes detached from humanity, seeing himself as above mere mortals. Eric slowly becomes more violent and unpredictable and eventually snaps, culminating in him attacking his brother and raping his brother's wife. After this, he goes on a destruction spree across America, killing anyone in his way. It's a really dark story that doesn't shy away from graphic violence. Green River Killer. This one's a true crime comic, but instead of focusing on the serial killer himself, it follows Detective Tom Jensen, the guy who spent 20 years tracking down the Green River Killer, Gary Ridgway. What's really fascinating is that it's actually written by Jeff Jensen, Tom's real-life son. The book flips between the past, when Ridgway was murdering dozens of women in the 80s, and the present, where he's finally caught and interrogated. Ridgway is very disturbing. He's completely emotionless, talking about his killings like they were just some chore he was doing. The guy literally says he killed so many women that he lost count. Instead of putting the focus on gore, Green River Killer dives into the mental toll on those hunting him, showing how Tom Jensen dedicated decades of his life to catching a man who barely cares about what he's doing. The whole thing leaves you feeling pretty empty and unsettled. A History of Violence. This one is a brutal crime thriller following Tom McKenna, just a regular guy running a small town diner, living a quiet life with his wife and kid, until one day two criminals try to rob his place and he kills them with almost unnatural efficiency. Turns out Tom isn't who he says he is, and he has a history with the mob. His real name is Joey. He and his childhood friend Richie pulled off a heist, robbing and killing a crime boss. Shortly after, however, vengeful mobsters captured Richie and presumably killed him. So Joey ran away, changing his name and starting a new life. However, because of the media attention, mobsters know where Joey's at and start tormenting him and his family. The most disturbing thing in this comic to me is when Joey finds out that Richie, his best friend, was never killed, but in reality he'd been kept prisoner and tortured for years, becoming utterly disfigured, missing both legs, both arms, and one of his eyes. It's a really disturbing sight. Ice Cream Man. Ice Cream Man is a horror anthology series where every issue tells a different self-contained story, but there's always one constant: the Ice Cream Man himself. He's not just some serial killing ice cream man or something like that. He seems to be a kind of trickster god, or maybe even the devil, I don't know. Either way, he seems to feed off of human misery. Sometimes he just watches, sometimes he pushes people toward their worst possible fates, but either way, he's always there smiling. The stories range from psychological horror to pure existential dread, with characters dealing with addiction, grief, madness, and death. And it pretty much always ends horribly for everyone. The art style makes it even worse because it's bright and clean, almost cheerful, which just makes the terrifying moments hit that much harder. There's also this underlying mystery about who the Ice Cream Man actually is, and his connection to another being named Caleb, who's this mysterious cowboy guy who tries to thwart the Ice Cream Man. The series keeps things deliberately vague, so we don't know much about them, but there's a cosmic horror element to it that I really like. Invincible. Invincible has picked up quite a bit of steam the last few years thanks to the popular animated adaptation on Prime. It starts off as a pretty typical superhero coming of age story. A teenager, Mark Grayson, discovers he has superhuman powers, flight, super strength, and near invincibility inherited from his father, Omni-Man, who's basically this world's version of Superman. He begins to fight crime and struggles to balance his normal life with his superhero persona. You know, standard superhero stuff. Now, to talk about why this comic is disturbing, I need to reveal some spoilers, but these are revealed fairly early early in the series. Omni-Man is not the hero everyone thinks. He's actually part of the Vitrumite Empire, a race of hyper-powerful conquerors who invade and enslave planets, and Earth is next on the list. In one of the most shocking moments in the series, Omni-Man's true nature is revealed when he massacres every member of the Guardians of the Globe team, a group of heroes something like the Justice League. After this, the gloves are off and we see the horrors of an evil superhuman god. The series is chock full of hyper-violent, brutal deaths, with people getting ripped in half, heads exploding, limbs torn off, and entire cities being massacred. Not to mention the psychological horror of Omni-Man's worldview and his son, whose world is completely shattered, especially after his father beats him half to death, killing thousands of innocent people in the process. The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen. Another Alan Moore comic. You've probably heard of the League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, if anything because of the 2003 film adaptation, which unfortunately was a big flop. It's essentially a Victorian-era superhero team-up, but instead of superheroes, it's classic literary characters like the Invisible Man, Dorian Gray, Dr. Jekyll, and so on. The comic is a lot darker and more disturbing than the film. For instance, when they find the Invisible Man, he's using his invisibility to violate girls at an all-girl correctional school. Even worse, he's impregnated several, and these poor girls think that the Holy Spirit has given them immaculate conception like Mother Mary. All the violence is much more graphic as well, especially around Mr. Hyde, who straight up rips people to pieces. Lobo. Lobo is one of the most violent, unhinged, and disturbing characters in DC history. He's basically a space biker from hell with no morality, and all he wants to do is destroy things. Originally created as a parody of 90s anti-heroes, he ended up becoming one of the most over-the-top killers in comics. He's the last of his species, not because his planet was destroyed or anything tragic like that, but because he personally wiped out his entire race just for fun. Now he's an intergalactic bounty hunter who takes jobs just for the thrill of killing and doesn't care who gets in the way. Some of Lobo's most insane moments include murdering Santa Claus on a contract from the Easter Bunny, massacring an army of clones of himself because he didn't like them, and literally punching out God. He's so violent that both heaven and hell have banned him from the afterlife, meaning he's stuck roaming the universe, causing endless destruction. Lobo is also literally unkillable. If you blow him up, every drop of his blood can regenerate into a new Lobo. Kind of sounds like Tomie. Anyway, he's one of the coolest characters in DC history. Marvel's Ruins. Imagine a world where every superhero origin went horribly, grotesquely wrong. That's basically Ruins. It follows journalist Phil Sheldon as he travels across a dying dystopian version of the Marvel Universe, discovering that mutations, cosmic radiation, and experiments don't create heroes, they just kill people in horrifying ways. In this world, the Hulk dies screaming as tumors explode from his body, the Fantastic Four mutate into deformed husks instead of gaining powers, and Spider-Man turns into a cancer-ridden mutant with extra limbs. The X-Men are biohazards suffering from uncontrollable lethal mutations, and Captain America is a failed government experiment left as a rotting, mindless corpse. Instead of becoming heroes, everyone is either dead, deformed, or hunted down by the government. All of Marvel's most iconic characters are just walking horror stories in this. This is just a sad descent into despair. So if you want to see one of the most disturbing versions of the Marvel Universe, Ruins is a great contender. Miracleman. Originally a lighthearted British superhero from the 1950s, Miracleman was completely reimagined by Alan Moore into one of the darkest superhero deconstructions ever written. The story follows Michael Moran, who rediscovers his ability to transform into Miracleman, only to learn that his past was a government lie and superheroes are far more terrifying than inspiring. The real horror comes from Kid Miracleman, his former sidekick, who never reverted to his human form and has spent decades growing more powerful and psychotic. This leads to a disturbing event, a massacre in London where he slaughters over 40,000 people, tearing civilians apart, skinning them alive, and turning the city into a charred wasteland. After finally stopping him, Miracleman comes to a chilling realization. Humanity can't be trusted to rule itself, so he and his kind take control of the world, creating a false utopia where humans have no real freedom. Misery Loves Comedy. Misery Loves Comedy is a collection of dark comedy comics by Ivan Brunetti. This anthology compiles the first 3 issues of Brunetti's series Schizo, along with additional material spanning 15 years of his career. Known for his self-loathing and depression, this is basically a look into the mind of a cartoonist grappling with his inner demons, filled with all kinds of disturbing imagery, all with a comedic vibe. My Friend Dahmer. Yes, this is a comic book about one of the most famous killers in history, Jeffrey Dahmer, but this one stands out as it's told from the perspective of someone who actually knew him in high school. The comic was created by Durf Backdurf, yep, that's his real name. He's a former classmate of Dahmer's and recounts his teenage years in the 1970s long before he became a a murderer, exploring the warning signs of a deeply disturbed kid being completely ignored. So rather than focusing on the crimes he's known for, my friend Dahmer follows an increasingly unstable teenager who's spiraling into alcoholism, isolation, and disturbing obsessions, while the people around him either laughed at his bizarre behavior or looked the other way. Nailbiter. Set in the fictional town of Buckaroo, Oregon, Nailbiter follows a disturbing mystery. Why has this small town produced 16 of the world's most brutal serial killers? Among them is Edward Nailbiter Warren, who chewed his victims' fingers down to the bone before killing them. There's also the WTF killer, who staged murders so bizarre that they made no sense. Another example is the blonde, who seduced men and then scalped them alive. When an FBI agent investigating Buckaroo's dark secret goes missing, NSA agent Nicholas Finch teams up with Buckaroo sheriff and the now retired Nailbiter himself to unravel the truth. As they dig deeper, they uncover that something darker lies behind Buckaroo's killers. The Nightmare Factory. Another horror anthology comic based on the horror writing of Thomas Ligotti. I'll give you a quick rundown of the 4 stories. The Last Feast of Harlequin follows a cultural anthropologist with a fascination for clowns and Harlequin imagery. He stumbles into a strange winter festival in a remote town. As he investigates, he notices the eerie behavior of the townspeople, particularly their devotion to an unusual holiday ritual where everyone dresses in what looks like clown makeup. He eventually discovers that the entire town is involved in an inhuman cult, worshipping some ancient cosmic horror entity. In Dream of a Mannequin, a psychiatrist becomes obsessed with one of his patients, a woman who claims that she's not real but a mannequin in a dream. As he works with her, he begins to experience bizarre shifting realities. In Dr. Locrian's Asylum, a small town wants to erase the memory of a long-abandoned asylum, finally deciding to demolish it. However, in doing so, they awaken something ancient and terrible tied to the building. The asylum's past patients weren't just sick, they were touched by an inhuman presence, and now that presence has been freed to spread again. In Teatro Grotesco, a mysterious underground theater troupe known as Teatro Grotesco seems to appear in different cities, drawing in those obsessed with art and the unknown. Those who seek it out are never the same after witnessing a performance. Some disappear, some lose their minds, and others become part of the performance themselves. The protagonist, an artist, tries to resist the pull of Teatro, but he is already trapped in its orbit. So there you go, Nightmare Factory. Postal. No relation to the controversial video game series, Postal is a crime thriller comic set in the eerie off-grid town of Eden, Wyoming, a place exclusively populated by criminals looking for a fresh start. There's no law enforcement, and justice is dealt out by the town's mayor, who can and will openly execute anyone who goes against the town's ideals. The mayor's son, with Asperger's syndrome, Mark, is the town's mail carrier who everyone treats like shit. Due to his insane attention to detail, he begins to investigate a murder that leads to discoveries about the town's dark history and origins. It's not as horror-centered as a lot of these entries, but features all forms of violent crimes throughout. Plastic Forks. This one is just bizarre. Basically, a scientist specializing in reproductive studies creates a device designed to enable self-impregnation, meaning it would allow a person to gain the ability of asexual reproduction. It gets even more insane when his own device is forcibly implanted into him by one of his colleagues, leading him to be the test for his own sick experiment. So now he goes on a revenge mission. It's a really weird one. The Rattler. Another crime thriller, The Rattler follows Stephen Thorne, a victim's right advocate whose fiancé was abducted a decade ago. His life takes a strange turn when he begins to hear her voice calling out. Believing she must still be alive, he starts his journey towards finding her. Along the way, there's all kinds of brutal violence. The comic's in black and white, except for blood, which is bright red. The Sandman. The Sandman is a dark fantasy epic written by Neil Gaiman following Dream, the godlike ruler of dreaming. Throughout the series, there are several very disturbing sequences, including the infamous issue 24 Hours, where a diner full of people are trapped and psychologically broken by a man who's wielding Dream's stolen power. Over the course of a day, he forces them to confess their darkest secrets, mutilate themselves, and engage in unspeakable acts of violence, all while he sits back and watches like a cruel god. Then there's the Corinthian, a living nightmare who wanders the real world, murdering people and eating their eyes with the tooth-filled mouths that are hidden inside his own sockets. And that's just scratching the surface. There are gods who feast on human suffering, people trapped in infinite nightmares, and stories that twist so deeply into reality that the characters themselves don't even know if they exist. Savage Dragon. Savage Dragon looks like a typical superhero comic at first glance, but it's actually chock full of brutal violence and unhinged situations. It follows the Dragon, a large green humanoid with a fin on his head. All he knows is that one day he woke up in a field on Earth and that he has superhuman abilities like a healing factor and super strength, so he joins the Chicago PD to help fight crime. The series features gruesome deaths, extreme body horror, and a world that never resets like most comics. When characters die, they stay dead, often in horrific, shocking ways. The Dragon himself has been beaten into a coma, blown apart, and regenerated, and even forcibly used to breed a new race of superpowered beings. And also one time he fought Superman. Scars. Scars follows John Kane, a hardened homicide detective who stumbles upon one of the most sickening crime scenes of his career: the dismembered body of a 6-year-old girl, surgically cut apart and left in a box. The case sends Kane into a downward spiral, blurring the line between justice and vengeance as he becomes obsessed with hunting down the monster responsible. Another great crime thriller comic with some very disturbing subject matter. Severed. Set in 1916 America, the story follows Jack Guerin. We first meet him as a normal old man who happens to be missing one of his arms. One day he gets a strange letter and is forced to remember his past when he was just a runaway boy chasing his dreams of adventure, only to fall into the clutches of a nightmarish predator. The villain, known as the Salesman, is a smiling, soft-spoken cannibal who preys on lost children with his razor-sharp, inhuman teeth that he hides beneath his dentures. This one is more of a slow burn, but the building sense of paranoia and dread is great. We see several of the atrocities the Salesman commits before he finally gets to Jack. Like a young boy, he cannibalizes, leaving his body missing several limbs. It all builds up to Jack being kidnapped and tortured by the creep in a disturbing finale. Sin City. One of Frank Miller's most notable works, Sin City is a black and white noir masterpiece set in a lawless city. It tracks several different interconnected stories taking place here, and each one is disturbing in its own right. From Marv's revenge-fueled massacre against the cannibalistic serial killer Kevin, to Hardigan's doomed attempt to protect a young girl from the pedophile psychopath Rourke Jr., aka the Yellow Bastard. It's bleak, it's tragic, it's blood-soaked, it's awesome. Skreemer. Set in a nightmarish future where the world has collapsed into chaos and gangsters rule like warlords, the story follows Vito Skreemer, a ruthless, unstoppable enforcer who murders his way to the top of the criminal underworld. The comic takes on family tragedy, violent crime, and philosophical despair, shifting between Vito's bloody rise to power and the innocent lives he destroys along his way. Snow, Glass, Apples. This comic book adaptation is basically Neil Gaiman's original 1994 short story, but with illustrations attached. It's a twist on Grimm's fairy tales Snow White, but told from the perspective of the supposedly evil stepmother. The big twist here is that Snow White is actually a vampire, slowly killing her father by sucking his blood. It's a really disturbing version of the story with graphic art and descriptions of Snow White's evil acts, like when she seduces a monk in the woods and then drains his blood and for some reason black liquid drips from between her thighs, or like when she tears open her own chest and licks her heart before putting it back in. Stray Bullets. Unlike traditional crime stories that follow master criminals or detectives, Stray Bullets focuses on ordinary people who are caught in the crossfire of senseless violence, bad luck, and impulsive decisions that spiral out of control. The series is non-linear, jumping across decades to tell interconnected stories. A couple of disturbing moments include a child witnessing a brutal mob execution and being forced to help cover it up, and a man being casually executed just for being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Torso. Based on the real-life Torso murderer case, this comic follows Elliot Ness after he takes over as public safety director in Cleveland in the 1930s, where he faces a serial killer who dismembers victims, leaving only their torsos behind, with no head or limbs to identify them. Enough said. Unleash. Well, this is in alphabetical order, but it just so happens that the last entry on tier 2 is also one of the most disturbing. Unleash follows Emmy, a young woman who was brutally attacked and violated. Now she's become a sort of twisted vigilante on the hunt for the man who did it to her, and taking down other rapists along the way. She carries a katana, but her real weapon is what she calls the rape machine. No joke. A giant man wearing a strange outfit covering his entire body that looks kind of like a cross between a mummy and a gimp suit. Emmy leads the machine around by a chained leash, and whenever they encounter a predator, she unleashes him to do his dirty work. Very, very dirty work. Not only does he beat his victims, he then violates them as well. I guess that's why he's called the rape machine. It's a really disturbing concept, and it keeps you reading because you want to know who her attacker was, and also who the hell is the machine and why does he follow her every command. Well, I hope you guys enjoyed this first section. Next, we'll be moving on to tier 3, and let me tell you, each tier not only gets more obscure, but more twisted, so stay tuned. I have to give you guys a huge thank you. My Beneath the Trees explanation video really caught fire, and I just blew past 50,000 subs. In fact, now I'm past 60,000. I can't even really process it. I thought it would be months before I hit 50K even, so thank you all for watching and to all the new subscribers. I might make a 50K special or something, but I'm not sure what I would do. If you have any ideas, let me know in the comments. Shout out to Kill Me Katie as always for the intro and outro music, which is likely playing right now, and of course my patrons for supporting the channel. If you want your name displayed at the end of every video like these fine people, consider joining my Patreon. But I appreciate you guys watching at all. This is Grief speaking. Goodbye, friends.